I've talked a lot about sanding in relationship to kind of cabinet furniture and kind of custom work applications, but I wouldn't want to stop talking about sanding until I've covered some things that happen on the job site all the time, and that's things like windowsills and door jambs and things like that you might, when they come out to the job site, think that they're in really good shape, to just be installed and painted or stained. But experience has taught me that if you want something to stain and stain uniformly, you better sand the whole thing. And if you think that something's really smooth, but then you look at it, it probably could stand a little bit of touch-up sanding so that when you do get that nice enamel paint on it, you don't see those defects. So not only just on special projects like this, but just generally when you're working on the job site, just about anything that you're going to be working with could probably use a light sanding. And in some instances, there are things like, for instance, the example of the windowsill. Boy, if you don't sand that before you put in place, it's going to be almost impossible to sand it all the way out evenly because you're going to be getting into corners and stuff. Stair treads are another great example. You might have some stair treads come to you and like, oh, these look pretty good. But if you don't go ahead and sand them before you install them, then you're going to really get into trouble trying to be able to sand back against where they hit the riser or the skirt board. So not just on special projects, but pretty much anything on the job site, if you really want to be known for doing outstanding work and have really happy clients, spend a little bit extra time and sand. Okay, so here's some other applications though. The first one I want to show you, and this is an example, like sometimes we have to make our own stair treads or glue things up. And when you glue things together, the edges are generally not going to be perfectly flush. Now, obviously this I could run through a planer, but there are times when either we don't have a planer or we're glued up something that's wider than the planer we actually have. So one of the very, very few times that I would ever sand something cross grain is a situation like this. Because of these humps in these joints, if I start out sanding like this, when it's going over that joint, that offset, it may actually rock and dig that hole that we're talking about that you really want to avoid. So if I've got some rough edges like that, when I'm sanding a project like this down, and if you glued up a solid wood tabletop or desktop or something, this could be another example. But what I would do first is I would actually start going cross grain until I've gotten all those ridges flattened down. Then I turn and go with the grain. Now, when I'm sanding something like this with the grain, I'm going to go all the way, and then I continue keeping the sander moving. I'm going to go back and forth. I don't get up here and then jump over and come back. You go up, back, so that as you're moving across the board, you're constantly in motion, and that'll help keep you from getting a dig or getting a big cross-grain scratch. But that's some general information about using a belt sander on a project like this. So this would be an example of something. It could be a mantle shelf. It could be a wooden top, maybe for a window seat or something that we've added a piece of molding to the front of the plywood. So the first thing when you're getting ready to do a project like this, you just always want to make sure that you have a little bit of the solid wood up higher than the plywood. And the other thing that I would try and advise you to do if you possibly can is buy a domestic plywood that's got a thicker veneer. There are some of these plywoods that the veneer is so thin that you almost can't sand them. If you are working with one of those super thin veneers, my advice would be to get this as close to flush as you can, and then I would probably use this finishing sander, which is the least aggressive sander. It's going to take you longer to sand it down, but you'll have a lot less chance of burning through that veneer. Now, that is if this is going to be stain grade. If it was going to paint, I could be a little bit more aggressive. Now, the other thing is that I haven't scraped the glue off here yet, so you'd want to scrape the glue off. This actually, you're not going to be able to see it, but there's actually a tiny little gap right here. One of the things that I've learned where the glue didn't quite make a good contact, I can actually rub just a tiny bit of glue into that gap and then wipe all the glue back out and then sand over it. And as long as I'm creating sawdust as I go, the sawdust I'm creating will mix with the glue in that crack, and it actually makes a good filler. The key is you don't want to leave a bunch of excess glue, and you want to sand and get that sawdust mixed in with the glue immediately. But you can fill some little cracks that way, and it works really, really well. Now, this is just an example, of an MDF shelf. Again, this nosing's been glued onto it, but this would be a great example of where I could just scrape this glue off, and I could pretty well get after this with a belt sander back and forth across here against the most aggressive sander that I'm going to use. But what I have to be careful of, if I don't feather that out by coming back with like a random orbit sander or something, you can literally see that sanding line on something like this. So even if you're using, an aggressive sander and you're not worried about burning through the veneer, you still need to feather your sanding back so that you don't see that shadow line. That's when I talk about the difference between something that's going to paint and you're going to see a shadow. And of course, you also have to be real careful that you don't get any kind of a dig in there. Anyway, now, one of the other things that we do that's kind of challenging is anytime we're making like a cabinet door, you've got to get it sanded, especially if it's going to stain. You're going to have cross grain marks here when you first sand it to flatten it out. So you use the same principle you sand across. These parts are called the rails of the door, and then you come back and sand the stiles, getting as close as you can to these joints, and then go over the whole thing with a random orbit sander. Now, this is one of those key things, like this piece of plywood that's in here, I have to sand that before I glue it up because it'd be extremely difficult to get in there and sand it afterwards. If I did forget, this would be an example where I could use this triangular sander and probably get in there and do a pretty good job, but it's much, much easier just to sand it before you put it together. And as a good general rule on something like this, even if I'm working here where I've got this cardboard to protect it, I am still going to sand the back first and then flip it over and sand the face last. But again, this would be something where I might, depending on how flat these joints were, back in the old days, I'd always take a belt sander to this. But in today's world with these really good random orbit sanders like this one, especially the ones that have good dust collection, I might be more likely to even put like 80 grit or something on this to flatten it out, then use that Velcro and change it to a smaller grit and just keep going from there. So, things have kind of changed, and although this isn't quite as aggressive as a belt sander, it can get fairly close, and especially in that initial, like when I had that, if I had the 80 grit on there, I might go ahead and put a little pressure down, pushing down, because this won't dig a hole, at least nothing like a belt sander. I mean, I could eventually make a hole, but it'd be hard. That reminds me of one other thing. Anytime you're sanding with a sander like this, sometimes there's this tendency to want to get up on the top and really put pressure on the edge, but that can leave you with an uneven surface that'll come back to haunt you later on. So again, let the sander do the work. You can put some pressure down as long as you're just flat down on top of it. But don't be turned up on edge and really using it to grind in one spot. Let the sander do the work. If you feel like you need to be more aggressive, just get a more aggressive paper and put a little bit of pressure, but not a lot. So the final applications, it's quite similar. This would be the example of like the finished end of a cabinet where I've got wood here and I want to try and sand that joint down really, really flush. Again, depending on the quality of this plywood, I could, probably hit this lightly with a belt sander, or maybe that real aggressive 80 on the random grit, random orbit sander. And some of that kind of depends. I mean, if you're just getting into woodworking, or you've never used a belt sander, you may never use a belt sander very much, because the random orbit sanders are pretty aggressive now, can almost replace that belt sander. Now, one of the things that I do want to remind you of, for instance, if this was a cabinet and there was going to be molding coming around here, I could sand, being concerned about sanding that veneer, I could kind of tend to do this. This is an exaggeration, but I really want this to stay nice and square for looks. If this was going to paint, I definitely want it to stay nice and square. But also, if you think about running moldings or anything around this corner, it needs to stay square. So fight the temptation, be careful, but try to keep your sander flat. A lot of times, I'll still keep 2/3 of the sander over on this plywood. You just have to be really, really careful. And again, if this happens to be some of that plywood that barely has a veneer on it, I may just have to take my time and use a sander more like this. So that's not everything that I know about sanding, but hopefully I've shared a lot with you. One other thing, sometimes the simplest sanding procedure is just using your hands and a piece of sandpaper. On moldings, for instance, sometimes if you have a piece of molding and it's got a little chatter in it, or maybe it's got a little bit of snipe or an imperfection, sometimes you just have to use hand sandpaper. But make sure you can't just sand a small area. Anytime you're sanding something, you have to kind of feather it out, where you do some real hard sanding right at that point, and then you kind of feather it out as you go. And sometimes sandpaper can just be as simple, sanding can be just as simple as, oh, I've got this sharp edge that doesn't feel comfortable to my hand, like the edge of a door jamb or something. Just take a piece of sandpaper, barely sand it, and break the edge. And by the way, I'm not a painter, but did you know that paint will hold better on a slightly rounded corner than will on a sharp corner? It just gives it a little bit better chance to stick. So sanding is one of those things that, there's not really people say, man, what I really, really want to do is just like be the best sander in the company. I want to get to do all the company's sanding. But it's critical, it's got to be done right. And so you want to be a good sander even if you don't do all the sanding. Thanks for taking your time to watch this presentation, and hopefully we'll see you again next time.